For the majority of this conflict, Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil infrastructure have been primarily land-based. Think burning refineries, blazing fuel depots, or thick plumes of smoke rising from a pumping station 500 miles behind enemy lines. But after seeing what has happened in the Sea of Azov over the last week, you get it. This time, Ukraine is bringing the fight to sea. And by sea, we mean its attacks are targeting Russia's tankers, and according to Ukraine, they've just started. In a series of strikes between July 8th and 9th, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces claimed that in one single night, it took out 14 Russian cargo ships and tankers as part of what military commanders called days-long coordinated attacks on the so-called Shadow Fleet, the aging vessels which Russia uses to sneak its oil past Western sanctions. In fact, Ukraine reported seeing flames from a vessel named Sonar 17 for an entire second day before it claimed that one was destroyed outright. Now, I need to be very clear. Everything we've discussed thus far is what the Ukrainian side claims, and yes, there are some issues with these numbers that we will explore later in our report. But there's another piece of evidence here. This isn't an isolated event. There are striking new clues pointing towards something more deliberate. These strikes weren't just lucky shots by random drones. They were orchestrated by Ukraine's newly created Deep Strike Center, a specialized command and control unit established within the country's drone forces for precisely this type of mission planning. You don't create an entire command center in response to one success. You do so because you have developed a new doctrine that demands it. That is why this story matters now more than ever. The destruction of Russia's refining capacity hits its ability to transform crude oil into fuel much harder. But the attack on tankers strikes at the heart of the Russian energy industry, their ability to sell exported oil in the first place. Sanctions were supposed to shut down that market, access for this trade, and the Shadow Fleet was designed as a way out. Now, one hull after another is catching fire. The question then shifts from how much oil has Russia lost to a far more disturbing question for Putin. If it can't export its oil and its tankers are burning in its own Gulf, then what? How long does the Kremlin have before its wartime economy succumbs under this pressure? Let us break down exactly what we know, what is confirmed, and most importantly, how do they all add up to one number that Russia admitted itself? A number which reveals just how much of their war effort is in actual danger. Let's talk scale, and let's be honest about it as we go. The headline figure comes from the man who oversaw this entire operation, Ukraine's drone forces commander, Robert Brovdi. He claims that in just 96 hours, Ukraine struck 35 tankers, cargo ships, and support vessels in and around the Sea of Azov. That's a big number, and as we will see, it isn't the only one circulating. Another channel tracking the strike group claimed there were 7 vessels hit. Then there was another that said 14. Others reported 12. The SBU provided its own count. In just one night, Ukraine struck 12 tankers, a tugboat, and cargo ship. Brovdi, however, claims a total of 35 vessels over 4 days, a figure which does not align with the others by any stretch of the imagination. That's just another reason why you might want to put quotes around claimed, but not enough of one to ignore it entirely. On land, Ukraine claims it also attacked Russia's Yug-Rusi oil loading terminal in the Rostov region, which is yet another key site for transferring Russian crude onto seagoing vessels, as well as approximately 45 military targets in occupied Crimea, including 3 fuel depots and the Saki thermal power plant. Of course, all of this comes from Ukraine, the side responsible for keeping score, but here's a number that I find harder to dismiss. Russia's own finance ministry announced that its federal budget had run at a deficit of 5.73 trillion rubles, or about $14.8 billion in the first half of 2026. That represents 2.5% of Russia's entire economy lost over just 6 months. And most significantly for our purposes, oil and gas revenue, which funds Putin's war effort, was down by 22.7% compared to the same period in the previous year. Sure, I'm not saying drones hitting tankers was responsible for all of this. Oil price drops, sanctions, fires at Russia's refineries over the last few months, they are all interconnected. However, what do you think about a campaign that has led to Russia losing 23% in its most important line item and facing such an enormous deficit? Regardless of your opinion on whether ship counts matter, that is Moscow's own ledger, written by their hand. The pressure is reaching their wallet. But why couldn't Moscow just stop this? Well, first we need to understand what exactly the Shadow Fleet is. These are often unmarked tankers in various states of disrepair that Russia uses to secretly circumvent Western sanctions and transport oil off the books. That's the entire purpose. They operate outside of standard tracking systems. However, being off the books does not equal speed or maneuverability. A loaded tanker waiting out in the Sea of Azov is slow, predictable, and easy to track, especially now that Ukraine has established its Deep Strike Center, specifically designed for striking these targets with inexpensive drones. When your sanction-evading lifeline becomes a sitting target, ripe for destruction by drones costing just a few $1,000s each, you don't have a bad week. You have a structural issue in your defense strategy. And this is only half the story. Let's zoom out and talk about what that means on land, because the two strategies are complementary. Take Ukraine's recent strike on Rosneft's Saratov refinery, for example. It didn't just damage part of the facility, it struck the critical unit responsible for processing 20,000 tons of crude oil per day. The refinery shut down that unit. With the strike taking out that part of the plant, Saratov's fuel production stopped being traded in St. Petersburg entirely. Overnight into July 10th, another blow landed. A fire broke out at the Ilsky oil refinery in Krasnodar region, which has an annual capacity of around 6.5 million tons of crude oil processing, after it was struck by Ukraine. If you enjoyed this breakdown so far using primary sources, please consider liking the video or subscribing to our channel, as it helps us continue making these types of videos. There's a logic behind all of Russia's energy issues that bears exploring. Plenty has been said about how much oil Russia has in storage, but what is really running out is its ability to turn that crude into usable fuel and transport it elsewhere, because refineries can be destroyed by Ukraine, as well as tankers. That creates an enormous problem for Putin. A supply choke point. There are still plenty of people who want the fuels which Russia produces, and therefore uses. The country's response has also revealed exactly what's happening with its fuel reserves and infrastructure. In 4 regions, Lipetsk, Nizhny Novgorod, Astrakhan, and Pskov, fuel rationing has come underway based on license plate numbers, allowing residents to fill up in odd or even-numbered vehicles depending on the day of the week. It's an act of desperation when supplies are low, and just across its border in Kazakhstan, officials have established 59 checkpoints in their attempts to curb a fuel smuggling ring where modified tanks were being used to siphon off valuable Russian gasoline, fuel that has become so scarce it is worth sneaking over the border. There may be debate about how many strikes actually occurred, but there's no debating the response. And Russia doesn't seem interested in finding a solution. Asked for his reaction on the situation, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov delivered an implicit threat. Ukraine continued to strike Russia, the more buffer zone it would create for itself, and so withering as the war goes on. Instead of promising to protect refineries or ensure safe passage for fuel tankers to port, this was a declaration that there is no end in sight, and by extension, no end in sight to the economic damage being done to Russia's energy sector. But can it? Can Russia really sustain its wartime economy even as fuel ships are burned to pieces by Ukraine's operations? It might be hard to say, but at least some observers think not. Perhaps most tellingly, those closest to the issue have started admitting this openly. For instance, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that Ukraine has already severely cut off Russia's fuel supply and forced it into importing fuel. That would mean a global oil giant having to buy gasoline from elsewhere. The significance of Ukraine's refinery strikes was even acknowledged at NATO's summit in Ankara, where then US President Donald Trump said the attacks were an escalation, but that they might be good for ending this war. It's also interesting because it echoes Russia's own economic projections from earlier in 2023, which showed its finance ministry predicting a budget deficit of $40 billion, or 5.7 trillion rubles, for the first half of 2026. And that was despite oil and gas revenues declining by nearly 23% from the previous year. No need to rely on Ukraine's numbers alone to know Russia is running out of options. But let's be careful with our framing here. What we're seeing isn't a breakthrough on the battlefield, it's economic strangulation. Burning tankers might not push the front line forward, and at least not yet. And if Russia is being squeezed like this, Putin doesn't seem to have any intention of retreating or making peace. Reuters, reporting from Kremlin-linked sources, says that he hasn't shown an openness to talks about going anywhere near a settlement anytime soon. In fact, the president remains dead set on achieving his goal of capturing all of Donbass. Speaking to The Telegraph, Czech Republic President Petr Pavel suggested that time is running out. He claimed if peace talks do not come back around, Putin will probably announce a general mobilization for Russia following its parliamentary elections between September 18th and 20th. This means the pressure on Putin's regime has become real, with Russia choosing to double down rather than negotiate in response. And that is exactly why this campaign should matter more, not less, to us right now. Ukraine has discovered a cost-effective lever operated by a single dedicated command, and it's hitting Russia where it hurts most, the very part of its military infrastructure which pays for everything else to exist. If this lever remains in place as Moscow continues its fiscal hemorrhage, then time itself is on Ukraine's side, at least on paper, even when it appears not to be on the battlefield. It's an important one, and we will continue to break down everything you need to know about what's coming next, from analyzing claims made by the SBU and Brovdi's timeline, to diving into Russia's own budget figures as they become available, with our mission always being to separate fact from fiction in real time. If you enjoy this type of deep dive into military and geopolitical analysis, make sure that you subscribe for more updates like these, and hit the bell icon so it appears on your YouTube home feed every time we publish a new video. There are plenty of other videos here about oil wars and their implications to watch now. And as for whether September will see the start of negotiations or mass mobilization, only time will tell.